I think we're all back from our comfort break, so there's lots to dig into, and I'm very excited to do so. Thanks so much again to Alice and the Garden Cinema for hosting this screening, and thank you to Yaya and Giulia for joining me in this post-screening discussion. As a rough outline of how we envision the discussion, and rough being the key word there, we wanted to set up some of the historical context of the LA Rebellion, so thinking, where this emerged from, this movement, and then go into the films themselves for a little bit, and then talk about archives, afterlives, possible points of resonance for contemporary Black filmmaking, not only in America, but maybe in Britain too. So perhaps I'll pass it over to Giulia to set up some of the historical context, to begin with.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, absolutely. So we find ourselves in Los Angeles, California. It's the late 60s, and it's 2 years after the assassination of Malcolm X and the Watts Rebellion. Again, in Los Angeles, there's been a lot of sort of confrontations with the police in Los Angeles after they attempted to arrest a young man. And there's rumors the police kicked a pregnant woman in LA, and it sort of all comes to the fore. And the Watts Rebellion really awake sort of a civil sense of justice in LA that was already latent. And in 1968, of course, with the assassination of Martin Luther King, there is all of a sudden a rise of political involvement on the UCLA campus, especially on a new program that UCLA has started sponsoring, which is called the Ethno-Communications Program. And this was an attempt by UCLA to really invite African-American students to join their famous filmmaking program. And they were marketing it as a diverse and political sort of program of study. And it worked in the sense that we started getting students that were interested in making a kind of cinema that spoke to new kinds of sort of consciousness. They were looking back to the forms of, for example, Italian neorealism, but to the concerns of third cinemas, of Solanas and Gattino's Manifesto, of Brazilian new cinema. And they were bringing to the fore the African-American experience. And it's really interesting, its connections to sort of the experimental movement as well. In New York, Shirley Clarke was one of the women filmmakers who abandoned New York after sort of the establishment of the anthology film archives that a lot of women filmmakers in New York were taking issue with. And went to LA, joined the program as well. And then in 1974, Tashom Gabriel begins teaching, and the program really begins to take shape. And we start seeing all this amazing talent joining forces there. They started a film club, which was called the Third Ward Film Club, to screen and debate revolutionary cinema. And then they start making films. And we start seeing this kind of film as well. And it's really is revolutionary in form, in content, and in the way that it was made.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth outlining again the pillars of third world cinema and an aesthetics of revolution, or liberation rather, that Tashom Gabriel sets up in his scholarship and teaches to these filmmakers at the time. So it's kind of fourfold. It's to decolonize minds, to develop radical consciousness that then would maybe lead to a revolutionary transformation of society, and to do all of that with a new film language. And I think you really see that coming through in some of these films that we've watched today.
They sort of had, I was doing my research, I was reading some interviews, and there was this quote by Fidel Castro that actually kept coming up, which was, "The duty of a revolutionary is to make a revolution." And it was sort of their film club motto that kept coming up. And obviously, how do artists make a revolution is through art. and revolutionizing what films look like. And I think Illusions really spoke to that, the idea of like, you fight your war, but I'll fight mine with the tools that are available to me, which is art.
Absolutely. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the tools that were available to them, because this is a really rare moment, as you say, where there's this historical coincidence of things coming together, and this influx of not only African Americans coming to UCLA, but also other communities. So we spoke earlier about Latin Americans, Asian Americans being part of this program too. So a real wealth of different voices, and being able to use the institutional facilities, but also, not working with a great deal of money. And, some filmmakers are talking about these cameras saying, these were Rolls Royces to us. This was so expensive, this equipment. And we really just made use of the limitations in aesthetic ways, and also working together on each other's films, right? So we see in the credit sequences for the films that we've watched today, Charles Burnett, who we spoke about earlier, serving as director of photography on a different image and cropping up in another credit sequence, I think. Julie Dash helping on Alile Sharon Larkin's film too. So this kind of spirit of collaboration and community, I think, runs through the LA Rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. They were working as actors and as crew on each other's films, which was both because they were students, and I think it's important to remember that they were a lot of them were MFA students, so they weren't as young, but they were students. They were there to sort of still develop their craft, which always amazes me that this was already what was coming out of those sort of thesis. Cycles was a thesis film for the MFA program, but they were casting each other as crew, as actors, and that's as much as sort of material revolution as an aesthetic revolution, this idea of really building community already in the way that we make art. And Julie Dash spoke about how she wanted to make Illusions while she was at the American Film Institute in LA, and they wouldn't let her. And she was saying the crew that she tried to hire would laugh when she was trying to pitch the film, and they just wouldn't give her the time of day. The professors wouldn't let her make this film. And then she joined the UCLA program through sort of friendship and becoming introduced to it. And then all of a sudden, all of these films became possible, and she met people who shared her vision. So community being both sort of a topic in the films, a material possibility for the films, and the audience for the films. I think it's important to stress as well.
Absolutely. And this sense of not only in the film club, but this shared kind of network of references. So Yaya and I were talking earlier about the fact that, we see the women in cycles reading Toni Morrison. Between Illusions and A Different Image, we have Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man being read in a different image. The quote that opens Illusions is from Ralph Ellison as well. So this sense of like a shared network of references, I think, is really important. Perhaps we can move to talking about the filmmakers a little bit more, and the fact that, Julie Dash and Alile Sharon Larkin come, as you say, in the mid-1970s, and Zeinabu, Irene Davis, comes a little bit later. She's quite often referred to as the baby of the group. But we were speaking a little bit in the bar earlier about this sense of passing on traditions, creating intergenerational, maybe too strong to say intergenerational when it's a matter of 5 years, but creating these connections of, passing down traditions and the ways that's important for the group.
I think when thinking about the group, something that is really amazing to take note of is that when you're reading or watching anything that sort of speaks about the group and how they all came to UCLA, the majority of them were not filmmakers before coming to UCLA, and a lot of them were on courses that were more around political science. So they were activists in many ways first, and they were encouraged onto the filmmaking program by people either in their community or varying different people at the university and faculty and students. When it comes to like Julie Dash and Alile Sharon Larkin, I think Alile Sharon Larkin came in the 70s and Julie Dash, and then Zeinabu came in like 83, originally on a Black Studies program and then transferred over to film. I think with these three women, and I think it's so amazing that we've seen their films together today, because there are other women that are part of the movement, like Barbara McCullough, and many others. But seeing these three films is amazing, because I think they draw on like three important points, which is like reclamation of like heritage. We see that especially in Cycles, a different image, and illusions. We see, you know, hints of it. And then also it's like the interconnectedness and sharing between women, which is very important for me, in illusions especially. And then lastly, I think like womanism, which you spoke about in your introduction, which I think in differentiating it from feminism would probably be that womanism is more focused, or it's more intersectional, focused on race and class as well. And it also incorporates family. So when we see that last scene in a different image, which is quite shocking to some people, where she accepts the gift, is because she's seeing what's happened to her in a wider structure. It's not necessarily saying that she's forgiven per se. So I think their emergence into the LA Rebellion, I think we started to see a lot more experimentation at that time. Throughout all of the films, there's this thing of like still and moving images, which I think is really amazing. I think that kind of marks their immersion into the group. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think drawing these points of connection, which is always the fun of a shorts program like this, and also noting their differences is really important. I mean, for me, it seems like, and, you know, let me know if you agree with this, but there's a kind of axis of critique that's being negotiated throughout these films. So as you say, the Julie Dash film, you know, she's making this film maybe 15 miles away from Hollywood and speaking directly to what she sees as a racist apparatus of filmmaking by inhabiting it and occupying it as a mode of critique. And then we have something kind of in between in a different image where instead of filmmaking, we get the images of advertising, of pornography, and the tequila ad and Playboy, shown to be ubiquitous in everyday life. So you don't have to be a studio executive to be surrounded by these images. And I think this works as a really nice bridging film between Illusions and Cycles, because in addition to that, you have this tremendous amount of time actually, and I really struck me watching it again today, a tremendous amount of time spent with Alana in her domestic space as she undergoes various rituals, processes of self-care, acts of creativity, whether it's with her ribbons, as we were talking about earlier, or drawing. And then we come to occupy that space of kind of total femininity, domesticity, ritual, and cycle. So I think it's a really lovely kind of overview of the different ways in which critique happens, whether it's this kind of satirical closeness to the object, or you're going away from it and producing those different images, right? I wonder if we could talk a little bit about invisibility across maybe illusions and a different image specifically. Invisibility, visibility, image making, this thing of seeing and recognizing being different proposals for the women in these films.
Okay. I found very striking the correspondence of the topic of invisibility in a different image and in illusion, and this idea of being right in front of them, and at the same time being unseen and being ignored, being mistakenly seen, being objectified, which I think in Illusions is perhaps taken as a possible position of power as well. It becomes to be possibly reclaimed, negotiated, while in Cycles, I think she is seen by her friends in her dream. But unseen in her domestic space, in a private space. So this, I think there's a great negotiation between the space, the public space, which is a landscape dominated by these patriarchal visuals and these struggles for social power, and even in friendships, there is a sort of this necessity to negotiate power dynamics and gender dynamics, all the way in illusions in the workspace, and obviously other kinds of potential romantic relations with the lieutenant, and finally in Cycles. I find it very a hopeful note to sort of finish on as the last short, because we see her being again seen and acknowledged and recognized by her friends, both male and female, which I think is a really important sort of trajectory for the story.
Yeah. For me, in terms of being seen and unseen, I think in Illusions, to start off, I think there's a moment when Esther and Mignon are having the conversation, and Esther goes, "They don't know," because like she's speaking quite loud, and Esther goes, "They don't know, girl, don't worry." And I think there's part of that moment where I think many viewers may for the first time realize that she's passing. Most black viewers would absolutely know that she is, but I think in that moment, and when they go on to have the conversation, where she has a moment where she's like, "I'm going to leave the industry, what am I doing here? The real illusion is me." And I think between then and when she gets back to the office, it makes me wonder when that power comes back into play, when the lieutenant finds out her secret and that power comes back into play, what the potential sort of could be for her if that hadn't happened, and how that sort of happening brings us back to reality and how that illusion kind of falls. But I think in Illusions, the whole, on the topic of like being seen, I don't know, for me, sometimes when I watch it, I don't, depending on the day I'm having when I watch it, sometimes I don't typically feel like she's unseen. I feel like the film is more a critique of, like, in that sense, just how silly racialization can be sometimes. And in terms of the industry, it's kind of like a commentary on the movement as well, LA Rebellion, because we kind of know between that set in the 1930s and then now, and then when the film was made, little progress had been made in the mainstream in terms of the images. I think that's really interesting when you look at it that way. And then with Cycles, I think through the dream sequence, I think Cycles for me is more about like creativity. And I always remember Alice Walker would say, creativity for black women is survival. And I love the fact that creativity is not used as something that is like for others. It's her going through a daily ritual. It plays with time. It's cyclical. But yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think when I watch Cycles, and I've spoken about this to both of you, but it really brings back, in really striking ways, how much self-care is rooted in black feminist ritual, as you say. Like the year before Cycles gets made, Audre Lorde writes, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation. That is an act of political warfare." And again, this metaphor that comes up in Illusions of fighting certain battles and stuff. I think you're absolutely right to draw the Alice Walker comparison there too. And I think these are just like I think it was very interesting there, Yaya, where you said, dependent on the day, I think about this film in different ways, because Illusions is a site of lots of, it's a divisive text for lots of writers, right? So Bell Hooks, in her Oppositional Gaze essay, looks to Illusions and she sees caring, affirmative gazes being exchanged between Mignon and Esther. Someone like Saidiya Hartman is very critical of this film. I found that kind of ambiguity or richness of relationship, where it can be read in many different ways and there are many different things going on, really carried over into a different image as well. And I was really struck actually when I was reading things by Larkin in preparation for this. In an article for Black Camera in 2003, she talks about the importance of creating love stories for Black American community. She says, "I collect coloured love stories wherever I go." And this is a very, intricately conceived one, I think. I was really impressed by it. Perhaps now we could talk about your time in the archives with the LA Rebellion for Elizabeth. I'm just conscious of time, but yeah.
Absolutely. if I can actually jump on, because what you just said really made me think
no,
about illusions. What you were just saying, actually, as I was watching it, the conversation that they have on the little sofa, sort of visible but unrecognized, perhaps. And they talk about, or Esther talks about, imagining herself being in the picture and not just her voice. It just always really reminds me of Frantz Fanon and his piece on waiting for himself in the movies, and that being the interval of expectation. And I thought that the film just really spoke to it so brilliantly. But yeah, so I encountered the LA Rebellion in the UCLA archives. UCLA is doing a fantastic project of preservation and restoration of these films. They started in 2011, and they are sort of now they rediscovered a lot of these prints in their archive, which had unfortunately been forgotten. And the process of reworking them, I think, is also a very political reminder of not only the difficulty of having these films made in the first place, but the struggle that they still embody and represent for survival, had not been cared for so many years. So it's wonderful that they're finally getting the attention they deserve. And another film I found in the archive that was incredibly helpful for my research was this collection of oral histories and interviews with all the filmmakers, which was really special. They had them on video as well as transcripts. And I think the transcripts are quite available online. They're easy to find. But seeing it on video and watching these filmmakers talk about their history and their story with these films and their story with the program, I thought was a very effective way to carry on this oral tradition of storytelling that we see in cycles, for example, as part of this sort of way to honor Black culture and sort of Black tradition and folk storytelling as well. So it was a good discovery, I thought, to the spirit of the movement as well. And hopefully the films are sort of starting to get distributed a bit more, which was sort of the desire behind this 2011 movement in the archive.
Yeah, and I realise now that we're talking about the afterlives of the LA Rebellion, as it were, we haven't covered the fact of their name being the LA Rebellion, right? So we were talking about the various names that are given to this group in scholarship, in program notes. The LA Rebellion term actually only comes forward in something like 1986, right? When Clyde Taylor does a retrospective of these films at the Whitney Museum for American Art in New York. Yeah, do you want to speak a little bit to that perhaps? Yeah.
Yeah, well, we were just chatting just now about sort of the way this name, LA Rebellion, is actually quite a contentious term. And you were pointing out other names that I actually
Tony Cade Bambara, who was one of the writers that wrote in depth about Julie Dash and some of the women in the movement, calls it Black insurgents at UCLA.
Yeah.
And
there's quite a few others,
Yeah, the Los Angeles School, lots of these terms circulating in the way that quite often happens with these marginal groups. They get given names by academics, the filmmakers kind of shrug them off, I don't identify with that, and eventually like one or two terms coalesce and become, useful strategies for distribution and
but also Clyde Taylor, who named it, is also... It was under contention for him until he died. He was still thinking about it, and in the end kind of accepted it as a marketing tool, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to the diversity that exists within the movement, which probably makes it hard to call it a movement in some ways, while at the same time, obviously, we need to recognize the fact that there was unity and there was community and there was collaboration. And despite the differences within the movement, that collaboration is still coming through. And every time, for example, in the oral histories, the filmmakers speak to it, they sort of laugh a little bit about the name, but end up saying, whatever you call us, the thing is, we were helping each other realize each other's vision. And that really united us on this front, on this struggle for decolonization of images, which is still our goals. A lot of them are still working today towards that.
Yeah, Ben Caldwell, one of the filmmakers of the movement, I think he came in the early 70s. He says they were emancipating the image, and I quite like that as a explanation for what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like organising around a kind of common enemy as well in Hollywood, but also in blaxploitation films that are coming out at the same time. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about, and Yaya, I'd like to turn to you here, about the ways in which these films and the kind of modes of production we spoke about resonate either with other histories of Black filmmaking globally, or maybe in Britain, because I know that's a research focus of yours. And yeah, whether it holds relevance, inspiration in a present moment.
Yeah, definitely. Well, in terms of like Black filmmaking movements in Britain, there is definitely for me a thread that I can see between the LA Rebellion and the movements, the workshop movements that came in the 80s. I think for me, they were all looking to third cinema as inspiration, whether that be Afro-Cuban cinema like Sara Gomez, African cinema, especially Francophone African cinema, because especially, I don't know if we mentioned the African Film Society that was at UC Berkeley, and how that how Clyde Taylor came from there and came to UCLA, and how that all sort of merged. And in terms of today, there's definitely a wide range of Black filmmakers, especially in the arena of shorts, making a lot of films. Funding is in a terrible place, but post 2020 and the events of that year, there has been more funding that has opened up to tell a variety of stories to varying degrees of strength and honesty and truth, of course. What we were talking about earlier is I was wondering how sort of this movement can help people to realize sort of the tools that they have collectively to be able to make said films. Because with the LA Rebellion especially, the first task that they were given at UCLA upon coming to the school was to make a film called Project One. And I think they had about 10 weeks and a small camera to make a film. And what it done is it really forced them, or a lot of them were very motivated to do it already, hence why they were on the film program, but it drew them closer to figuring out how they can make these images with their conceptual framework. And I think that's really important. Whereas now we have more access to varying technologies if you get a grant or funding, but whether or not we have the power or to craft images that are emancipating is another question. So I was just sort of, when we think about how this movement came about, various sort of things would have contributed to it, global struggles, and we have many global struggles right now. How can that sort of spearhead into a similar thing across the diaspora is a constant question that I have, that I don't have the answer to right now. No,
absolutely. And I think the question that's always really interesting for me is how to do it in a sustained way, right? So you mentioned that there was kind of an influx of funding that comes after 2020. We're talking about the LA Rebellion in the context of the What's Uprising. So whether it can, keep going beyond these like flashpoints, I think is a really interesting question.
Well, like even because not to, I don't want to romanticize the movement and act like it wasn't in a university. It was in an institution still, but with very little funding. I think they got something like 17 grand to kickstart the MUC, which then kickstarted the Ethno-Communications program. But still in universities, I don't know, do people have the space for that now? Is that, we're seeing now that is not, there's no space for that. And we were saying earlier, as sort of tutors get cut, as professors get cut and tutors get cut, integral courses get cut from degrees, and it's a cycle. So just wondering where the space is for that now and how that can be pushed.
Absolutely, like a tremendous squeeze on the humanities at the moment. Is there anything else you'd like to cover that we haven't touched on before I open it up to the audience?
I think, just before opening it up, thinking of these films as sort of archival films in this afterlife and second life, how special it is, again, without romanticizing it, but how special it is to be able to watch them today and think about the interaction they can have with a contemporary moment, and sort of the continuous maturation we can have as viewers in the interaction with them, and perhaps use them to weave further counter narratives, which maybe just even the invitation that they pose to us is enough. They will have succeed, I think, as we're here watching them today.
Absolutely. Any questions? We have a roving mic and still a wealth of knowledge between my two panelists to tap into. So do feel free to comments, questions. We have a little bit of time left.
Hi. Thank you for that wonderful overview of the, I'm still going to say movement because I don't have a better word. I'm really interested in, there are different forms of, I guess, emancipation that is active within the filmmaking practice. There's the desire to produce an emancipatory image, which we see in the films very clearly. And then there is this desire to find a way of working that is perhaps suited to a more community-based practice, which I think is really embedded in Solana Sanguitino's article as well. And I wondered if you could say more about how they developed modes of practice that were maybe less hierarchical, more community-based, and what form that took, and maybe for filmmakers, what we could learn from that method of practice. It's a bit of a long-winded question. Sorry, I was thinking out loud.
I will say a little bit first. So what I'm very interested by is like Eliseo Taylor, who's seen as the person that sort of kicked it off. Before he came to UCLA, he was in the wake of the Watts Rebellion about 1965. He was taking cameras to the community to help kids in Watts to make films. And I think that is one of the core things that sort of came into how the movement was conducted. One of the main things that Toni Cade Bambara wrote about the movement is that also the audience were actively engaged. The audience would then become actors, it was like a 360 system. It wasn't as, it wasn't like screenings and then go home. It was like really engaged. And also the cultural theorists that came in, like Shomi Gabriel and Clyde Taylor, were also tutors of these people, and also throughout the movement contested their place as critics, because that's what they saw themselves as first, and realised that created a barrier. So it was just everyone sort of trying to various degrees remove the hierarchical structure, which obviously still does exist because you have a director and then you have, crew, but that's what they were trying to do essentially. I think you could speak more to the specifics.
Yeah, I think to that point, the fact that they also worked on each other's films as on different roles, I think that helps sort of dampen perhaps the hierarchy a little bit, as we're taking turns being directors, we're taking turns being grips. We are helping making visions come true. But as you say, I think incredibly important, and speaking to the Solana Sanguitino's article, the idea of showing these films in non-theatrical settings so that communities could be involved in the dialogues. They could watch these films in spaces that perhaps facilitated feeling all equal within the space. I think using the space is really interesting as well. Like space and time in the LA Rebellion films, I think is a very interesting experimentation of it. And also in a lot of the interviews, the filmmakers point out this desire to maintain open a dialogue with South LA and the neighborhoods. LA is such a sprawling, it's not really a city, it's sort of a collection of cities. So it can feel very dispersive, and the idea of traveling with these films around LA, making it accessible, because films like this, I think one of the greatest issues with them is access today. So really bringing the films to the people, and also contributing to making the Black arts movement of the 60s a social movement, and integrating other Black cultural forms such as visual arts, music, folklore, collaborating across arts, also helped bring the film into new venues and to new practitioners who can then sort of bring it to their audiences and sort of cascading around the community through even word of mouth.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question?
Hello, can I just say thank you very much. I'm so glad I came to this showing of it, because I've learnt so much. I'm not a filmmaker, I know nothing about it, but I'm a historian, and I think that period is incredibly important. So much change was happening in the early 70s. I was a young teenager then, and we actually thought things were going to change with the Sex Discrimination Act and race relate and all the rest of it. And that hasn't happened. The one question I'd like to know is, in the Hollywood film, is it based on a true story? Is it a particular individual who was, they saw as passing? Was that created, or was it a factual story? Do you know?
As far as I understand, it's a speculative story. So someone like this might have been involved in filmmaking in the early 1940s, but not based on a specific individual.
Yeah, I think it's sort of speaking to the genre within classical Hollywood of the quote-unquote tragic mulatto, and sort of trying to reclaim that narrative, which, quite problematic, I would say, within the history of Hollywood studio system, and telling the story in a different way, from a different perspective.
Thank you so much. I think you're right. These films speak to a moment of tremendous hope and possibility, and yeah, what comes of it in these films is really, really amazing. Yeah, we've got one more question at the front. I think we've got time.
Thank you. This has been really great to kind of witness and to hear your thoughts on contextualizing the films. My question isn't directly about the films. I guess it's that there's a lot of reference to literature by Black authors throughout the films, and also, I know you made the reference to the critique that Toni Cade Bambara was doing, but also she existed as an editor and a writer, and I know during that time, for a lot of Black writers, they were questioning whether the momentum of the civil rights era was still palpable in literature. And it's interesting how it looks like the momentum of the civil rights era picks up in the LA Rebellion. It's something I didn't know about beforehand. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about kind of that relationship between the politics of the era and the era it followed, and how the relationship between the writers, the filmmakers, all the kind of cross-disciplinary movements. There's a much more succinct way of asking that question, but there we go. Thank you.
I think for me, one thing that's very important in noting is Angela Davis was an instructor at UCLA at the time of the early years of the rebellion, and then obviously once she was fired twice, wasn't she? Yeah, she was fired once for, what was she fired for? Accusations of being in the Communist Party, and then she was fired for saying police are pigs, calling a policeman a pig. So she was fired twice, and then she went to prison, and she didn't come back to UCLA. So that momentum, you had Black Panther students on campus. You had and 2 Black Panther students were killed in and around UCLA, and that's what kind of spearheaded. That's one of the things that spearheaded the early fight to get more students of color on the program. So you had all these things that were happening, but then you also had filmmakers that were from Africa. So Haile Gerimo is one of the biggest filmmakers of the movement, made Bush Mama, Harvest, 3,000 Years, and a few other notable films. Was there to Show Me Gabriel, one of the cultural historians of the movement, was also from Ethiopia. You had a number of Nigerian students that were part of the rebellion, and there was just an overall awareness that they had of global struggles. And in terms of literature, for me, especially the women who were engaging, I think, with writers such as Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Toni Cade Bambara, June Jordan, it was bringing their images to the screen, not in direct adaptations, but in a very powerful way that honoured the way that they wrote and the stories that they were trying to bring to light, better than any of the adaptations of the time, the Hollywood adaptations of the time, if you ask me. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that is about all we have time for. We have to be out of here by 6. But thank you very much to my panelists, and thank you very much to you for your questions. It's been a really, really lovely afternoon.